Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies. And this is African Architects, Order of, from an Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. African Architects, Order of, sometimes called African Builders. Of all the new sects and modern degrees of Freemasonry which sprung up on the continent of Europe during the 18th century, there was none which, for a time, maintained so high an intellectual position as the Order of African Architects, called by the French as seen here, and by the Germans here. A Masonic sect of this name had originally been established in Germany in the year 1756. But it does not appear to have attracted much attention, or indeed to have deserved it. And hence, amid the multitude of Masonic innovations to which almost every day was given birth, an ephemeral existence, it soon disappeared. But the society which is the subject of the present article, although it assumed the name of the original African architects, was of a very different character. It may, however, be considered, as it was established only 11 years afterwards, as a remodification of it. The new Order of African Architects owed its existence to the Masonic zeal and liberal views of the great monarch Frederick II of Persia, to whom also the now flourishing ancient and accepted rite traces its origin. No monarch in the royal catalogue of Europe ever was so intimately connected with or took so much interest in Masonic affairs as the illustrious King of Persia. He was to the modern institution what tradition says Solomon of Israel was to the ancient, and if his life had been prolonged for a few more years until the Masonic orders which he had established and patronized had acquired sufficient vigor for self-support, and until the vast Masonic designs which his wisdom and zeal had initiated had gained permanent strength through his influence, there can be little doubt that the Order of African Architects would now have been the ruling power of the Masonic world. It would not, it is true, have opposed the propagation of other sects, nor interfered with the active and dogmatic jurisdiction of supreme councils or of grand lodges, for its favorite motto was tolerance of all. But by its intellectual power and by the direction which it would have given to Masonic studies, it would have vastly elevated the character of the institution and would have hastened that millennium for which all Masonic students are now so fondly looking, when every lodge shall be an academy of science. The memory of a society whose intentions, although unfortunately frustrated by adverse circumstances, were so praiseworthy, should never be allowed to pass into oblivion, but rather should be preserved for imitation, and in some fortunate future for resurrection. Hence I flatter myself that the present article, in which I shall endeavor to give some details of its object and history, will not be altogether without gratification to the reader who takes any interest in the subject of Masonic progress. In the 18th century, adventurous Masons sought to build many temples after their own devices, most of which have fallen into decay. But the Order of African Architects is a block from the ruins which is well worthy of preservation. Frederick II, King of Persia, who had been initiated while a prince, and in the lifetime of his father, soon after he ascended the throne, directed the attention of his great and inquiring mind to the condition of Freemasonry, for which, from his first acquaintance with it, he had conceived a strong attachment. He soon perceived that it was no longer what it once had been, what it was capable of being, and what it was, in his opinion, intended to be. The great minds in its bosom, who in the olden time had devoted their attention to science and philosophy, had passed away, and the Masonic leaders, such as Hund and Niggy, and Rosa and Zinzendorf, were occupying themselves in the manufacture of unmeaning degrees and the organization of brothel rites, in which a pompous ceremony was substituted for philosophical research. Frederick appreciated the capacity of Freemasonry for a higher destiny, conceived the plan of an interior order which might assume the place and perform the functions of a Masonic academy. The king commissioned these ideas to several distinguished Masons, the most prominent whom were Dr. Ernest Stahl, and the counselor Charles Frederick Coppin. To them he instructed the duty of carrying his design of a Masonic Reformation into effect. Accordingly, in the year 1767 at Berlin, Coppin, as the first Grand Master, assisted by Stahl and several other men of letters, established a new Masonic sect, order or rite, call it what you please, upon the old and most extinct society of African builders, whose name they preserved and whose system they extended and perfected, but whose character they entirely changed by such important modifications as gave to the new institution an original condition. They formed a code of statutes in conformity with the views of the king, and which were therefore very different from those which regulated the other Masonic bodies of the same period. They commenced with the declaration that the principles which should govern them were to fear God, to honor the king, to be prudent and discreet, and to exercise universal tolerance towards all other Masonic sects, but to affiliate with none. Hence, when the Baron Hun, the author and chief director of the widely spread rite of strict observance, whose influence had extended over so many contending sects of German and French Masonry, sought to establish a union with the growing order of African architects. They peremptorily declined all his solicitations. As long as the order existed, it remained independent of and unconnected with every other. In fact, it carried its opposition to any mingling with rival rites to such an extent that the Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, when an applicant for admission into its fold, was rejected simply because he had formerly taken an active part in the contentions of several of the Masonic sects. The Order of African Architects made the history of Freemasonry its peculiar study. Its members were occupied with profound researches into the nature and design of the ancient mysteries, in which they found, as they supposed, the origin of our institution, and investigated the character of all the secret societies which were in any way assimilated to Freemasonry. They also diligently cultivated the sciences and especially mathematics. At their meetings they read essays on various subjects, and the members communicated to each other the results of their investigations. They published many important documents on the subjects which they had discussed, some of which are still extant and have afforded literary aid of great value to subsequent Masonic writers. Every year during the life of King Frederick, the order bestowed a medal of the value of 50 ducats on the writer of the best essay on the history of Masonry. The recipients were always gratuitous, notwithstanding which the chapters always relieved such members as became indigent and in need of assistance. The meetings were always of a scientific or literary character, and in some of the chapters the proceedings were conducted in the Latin language, a sufficient evidence of the educated attainments of the members. In their receptions of candidates they were exceedingly rigorous, respecting neither wealth nor rank nor political influence, if moral and intellectual qualifications were wanting. An example of which has already been given in the rejection of the Duke of Brunswick, alluded to above. In their ceremonies they were very simple, making no use of aprons, collars, or other decorations. They looked more to the spirit and intent of Masonry than to its outward form. The epithet of Africans they derived from the fact that in their studies of Masonic history they commenced with Egypt, in the mysteries of whose priesthood they believed that they had found the origin of the modern institution. Hence, one of their most popular works was the Trata Ripoa, or Initiations in the Ancient Mysteries of the Egyptian Priest, written by their founder and Grand Master, the Counselor Frederick Coppin, a work which, published first at Berlin in the year 1770, passed through many editions and was subsequently translated into French and was deemed of so much importance, edited by Regan as late as the year 1821. It was a standard authority among the African architects. Frederick the Great was very liberal to this society, which, indeed, may very well be considered as an offspring of his genius. A year after its organization, he caused a splendid building to be erected for its sole use in Silesia under the special supervision of his architect, the Hermel. He endowed it with sufficient funds for the establishment of a library, a museum of natural history, and a chemical laboratory, and supplied it with furniture in a style of eloquence that was worthy of the king and the order. And this library was amassed by the efforts of the members and the contribution of friends, among whom the most conspicuous was the Prince de Liechtenstein of Vienna. A large collection of manuscripts and rare works on masonry and the kindred sciences, which no other Masonic society could equal in value. While its royal protector lived, the order was prosperous and of course popular, for prosperity and popularity go together, in Masonry as in all other mundane affairs. But Frederick died in the year 1786, 19 years after the first establishment of the society, and in the following year the Order of African Architects ceased to exist, having not quite completed its second decade. A lodge, or rather chapter, it is true, is said to have continued to meet in Berlin until the year 1806, but it exercised no Masonic influence, and must, in all probability, have greatly deteriorated from the character of the original foundation. Such is the history of an institution which, in its incipiency, gave every promise of exerting a most wholesome influence on the Masonic order, and which, if it had lasted to the present day, and had been always controlled by intellectual leaders, like those who directed its early days, must have contributed most powerfully and successfully to the elevation of Freemasonry throughout the world. On the esoteric or internal organization of such a society, some account, however meager, cannot fail to be interesting to the Masonic student. Kadicki, in his work, quotes from a ritual of the order, that namely, which was founded in 1756, and to which the more recent order of Frederick succeeded. The following legendary account of its origin, a legend certainly more curious than authentic. When the number of builders in the East was greatly reduced by the continued prevalence of wars, they resolved to travel into Europe, and there to form new establishments for themselves. Many of them came into England with Prince Edward, the son of Henry III, and were soon afterwards summoned to that kingdom into Scotland by the Lord Stuart. Their establishment in Persia occurred about the Masonic year 2307. They were endowed with lands and received, besides the privilege of retaining the ancient usages of the Brotherhood, which they had brought with them, subject to every proper restriction that in all other respects they should conform to the ordinary laws and customs of the country in which they happened to reside. Gradually they obtained the protection of several monarchs. In Sweden, that King Ing, about the year 1125. In England, of Richard the Lion-Hearted, about 1190. In Ireland, of Henry II, the father of Richard, in 1180. And finally in Scotland, of Alexander III, who was contemporary with St. Louis, about the year 1284. This legend could not, however, have been admitted as veracious by the founders of the Second Order of African Architects, whose history has been the subject of the present article. They could have looked upon it only as a symbolical adumbration of the historical truth that Masonry came originally from Egypt and the East, and was gradually and often by fortuitous circumstances, among which the Crusaders played an important part, extended and ramified into the various countries of Europe. As the Order of African Architects professed itself to be a Masonic organization, all its instructions were, of course, based upon the three fundamental degrees of ancient craft masonry. The degrees of the rite, for such it is clearly entitled to be called, were 11 in number, divided into two classes, designated as temples. The first temple consisted simply of the 3 degrees of ancient craft masonry, but the instructions in these 3 degrees were far more extensive and historical than in any other rite, and were intended to prepare the initiate for the profounder investigations into Masonic history, which occupied the higher degrees. It was not, indeed, until the candidate had arrived at the 7th degree that the veil of mystery as to the real design of the institution was removed. Until he became the possessor of that degree, he did not reap the full advantage of the researches of the order. The degrees were named and classified as follows. First Temple. 1. Apprentice. 2. Fellow Craft. 3. Master Mason. Second Temple. 4. Architect or Apprentice of Egyptian Secrets. 5. Initiate into Egyptian Secrets. 6. Cosmopolitan Brother. 7. Christian Philosopher. 8. Master of Egyptian Secrets. 9. Squire of the Order. 10. Soldier of the Order. 11. Knight of the Order. The last 3 were called superior degrees and were conferred only as a second or higher class, with great discrimination upon those who had proved their worthiness of promotion. The assemblies of the brethren were called chapters. The central or superintending power was styled a grand chapter, and it was governed by the following 12 officers. 1. Grand Master. 2. Deputy Grand Master. 3. Senior Grand Warden. 4. Junior Grand Warden. 5. Drapier. 6. Almoner. 7. Charcopalerly or Treasurer. 8. Breviarius, or Secretary. 9. Seneschal. 10. Standard Bearer. 11. Marshal. 12. Conductor. The African Architects was not the only society which in the 18th century sought to rescue Masonry from the impure hands of these charlatans into which it had well nigh fallen. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.